In January 1992, Sega controlled roughly 65% of the 16-bit console market in the United States. They weren't just outselling Nintendo, they were humiliating them. Faster mascot, meaner ads, an attitude that felt like it was designed in a focus group of every 13-year-old boy in America. And it was working. By the mid-90s, Nintendo looked like the old guard waiting to be swept away. But by early 2001, it was Sega announcing its exit from the console hardware business. The Dreamcast discontinued by the end of March. They went from market leader to third-party software developer in roughly 9 years. Meanwhile, the company Sega spent a decade trying to bury is now worth tens of billions of dollars and has released one of the best-selling consoles of all time. So how did the company that was winning the war end up surrendering, while the company that was losing it outlasted everyone? This is a story about discipline, arrogance, and the difference between chasing cool and building something that lasts. To understand the collapse, you need to understand the DNA. Nintendo was, at its core, a survivor. Founded in 1889 as a playing card company in Kyoto, they'd spent nearly a century cycling through toys, cards, and failed side ventures, taxis, hotels, instant rice, before they ever touched a video game. By the time they entered the North American home console market with the NES in 1985, caution wasn't a strategy. It was an instinct. Protect the brand, control the experience. Never bet everything on a single product cycle. Every decision ran through one filter. Does this survive if the market turns? Sega was built on the opposite instinct. They started as service games, an American company shipping coin-operated machines to US military bases in Japan in the 1950s. They merged, rebranded, and eventually became a Japanese corporation. But the American hustle never left. Sega launched products before they were ready, spent money before they'd earned it, and figured out the details somewhere between the press conference and the quarterly earnings call. Where Nintendo was the engineer who triple-checked the blueprints, Sega was the salesman who'd already sold the building before the foundation was poured. By the late 1980s, Nintendo didn't just lead the console market, they strangled it. The NES controlled an estimated 80+% of the US home console market at its peak. They had Mario, Zelda, and exclusivity contracts with third-party developers, so restrictive they bordered on monopolistic. If you wanted to make a console game in America, you played by Nintendo's rules. Or you didn't play at all. Sega looked at that empire and decided to go to war. In 1989, Sega launched the Genesis in North America, nearly 2 years before the Super Nintendo hit shelves. That head start mattered, but what Sega did with it mattered more. Sega of America, led by CEO Tom Kalinske, ran one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in consumer electronics history. The slogan alone was a declaration of war. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Every ad, every campaign, every shelf placement was designed around one idea. Nintendo is for children, and you're not a child anymore. Then came Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991, a mascot engineered from the ground up as the anti-Mario. He was fast, impatient, and literally tapped his foot if you put the controller down. He didn't wait for you, he judged you for stopping. It worked. By early 1992, the Genesis was outselling the Super Nintendo in the United States. Sega's market share peaked around 65%. They had momentum, cultural relevance, and a consumer base that treated console loyalty like identity. For a brief window, Sega wasn't just competing with Nintendo, they were replacing them. But here's the thing about winning on attitude. Attitude is not a business model. And while Sega was winning the marketing war, Nintendo was quietly doing something Sega never could. They were being patient. This is where the wheels come off. Sega didn't lose to Nintendo. Sega lost to Sega. The first crack was the Sega CD, launched in North America in October 1992, a $299 add-on for the Genesis that promised full motion video and CD quality audio. The technology wasn't ready. The games were mostly glorified interactive movies with the production value of a late-night infomercial. It sold around 2 million units worldwide, far below expectations. But worse than the sales was what it did to the brand. It introduced confusion where there had been clarity. And Sega didn't learn. In 1994, they released the 32X, yet another Genesis add-on. This time meant to bridge the gap to the next generation. Now consumers were staring at store shelves trying to figure out whether they needed a Genesis, a Sega CD, a 32X, or some Frankenstein stack of all three. It sold poorly and cannibalized the exact audience Sega needed for its actual next-generation console. That console was the Saturn, launched in North America in May 1995. And this is where arrogance turned into catastrophe. Sega of Japan and Sega of America were essentially at war with each other. Japanese leadership designed the hardware around 2D games, which dominated Japanese arcades. American leadership knew the market was shifting to 3D. The compromise was a dual-processor architecture that was nightmarish to develop for, a console designed by committee across an ocean. Then Sega made it worse. They surprise-launched the Saturn 4 months ahead of schedule at E3 1995, blindsiding their own retailers and developers. Stores that weren't included in the early launch pulled support. Developers building games for the original window had nothing ready. The Saturn arrived with a thin lineup at $399. Sony's response at that same E3 has become industry legend. Their entire pricing announcement was a single executive walking to a microphone and saying one word: $299. The audience erupted. The PlayStation went on to sell over 100 million units. The Saturn sold roughly 9 million. Sega hadn't just lost a console generation, they'd burned through the goodwill, the money, and the market position they'd need to survive the next one. While Sega was fragmenting its audience across 4 different pieces of hardware in 3 years, Nintendo did something radical. They waited. No add-ons, no panic. They kept selling the Super Nintendo and let its library do the talking. Games like Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, and A Link to the Past that gave the console a long, profitable tail. And they poured resources into their handheld business. The Game Boy, released in 1989, was technologically inferior to every competitor it faced. Sega's Game Gear had a color screen and a backlight. The Atari Lynx was more powerful on paper, but the Game Boy had Tetris, absurd battery life, and a price point parents could stomach. It sold over 118 million units across its lifespan. Nintendo understood something Sega never did. Technology doesn't win console wars. Games win console wars. And games need a stable platform that developers actually want to build for. When Nintendo finally launched the N64 in 1996, it wasn't perfect. The decision to stick with cartridges instead of CDs was a serious miscalculation. It drove Square, the makers of Final Fantasy, one of the most important franchises in gaming, straight to Sony. That loss stung, and it reshaped the industry for a decade. But the N64 had Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and GoldenEye. It sold nearly 33 million units. Not market leadership, but profitability, sustainability. And crucially, while Sega of Japan and Sega of America had been tearing each other apart, Nintendo's leadership stayed unified, stayed conservative, and stayed solvent. They didn't need to win every generation. They just needed to survive every generation. Sega had one last shot. The Dreamcast, launched in North America in 1999, was genuinely good. It was the first major home console with a built-in modem for online play. It had innovative games like Sonic Adventure, Jet Set Radio, and Shenmue. Critics loved it. It moved 500,000 units in its first 2 weeks in North America. But the damage from the previous 6 years was already baked in. Consumers had been burned by the Sega CD, burned by the 32X, burned by the Saturn. 3 abandoned platforms had taught people a simple, devastating lesson. If you buy Sega hardware, Sega might abandon you. And then Sony announced the PlayStation 2 for a 2000 launch. Consumers who might have taken a chance on the Dreamcast decided to wait. Developers who might have committed resources decided to hedge. The entire market froze around a console that hadn't even shipped yet. Sega couldn't afford to wait with them. Years of failed hardware launches had gutted their cash reserves. They were spending enormous sums on marquee titles. Shenmue alone reportedly cost upward of $50 million, including marketing. The Dreamcast needed massive, immediate sales to stop the bleeding. It eventually moved around 9 million units worldwide, respectable for a normal product, fatal for a company that needed a miracle. In early 2001, Sega announced it would exit the hardware business entirely, discontinuing the Dreamcast by March. The company that had once controlled 65% of the American console market would now make games for other people's machines, including Nintendo's. Here's what separates the two stories. Nintendo made mistakes, too. The N64 lost its generation to PlayStation. The GameCube launched in 2001, finished third behind the PS2 and Xbox, selling roughly 22 million units. By the mid-2000s, analysts were openly questioning whether Nintendo should follow Sega's path and go third-party. The obituary was being drafted. Nintendo's answer was the Wii. Instead of competing with Sony and Microsoft on graphical horsepower, an arms race they knew they couldn't win, they refused to play. The Wii launched in 2006 at $249 with motion controls intuitive enough for someone who'd never held a controller. It was the least powerful console of its generation, and it didn't matter. It sold over 101 million units. Nintendo hadn't outperformed the competition. They'd found an entirely different audience the competition didn't know existed. Then they nearly threw it all away. The Wii U, launched in 2012, suffered from an identity crisis that would have felt familiar to anyone who'd watched Sega in the 90s. Consumers couldn't tell if it was a new console or a tablet accessory for the Wii they already owned. The name was confusing. The marketing was unclear. The gamepad gimmick solved a problem nobody had. It moved only around 13 million units, Nintendo's worst home console performance in decades. For the second time in a generation, the obituaries came out. But here's where Nintendo's discipline showed. They didn't panic. They didn't fragment the Wii U's audience with desperate add-ons or rush a half-baked successor to market. They took their losses, studied what worked, and in 2017 released the Switch, a console that merged home and portable gaming into a single device. The idea was so clean it felt obvious in hindsight, but it only existed because Nintendo had spent years in the handheld market understanding how people actually play games when they're not sitting in front of a television. As of late 2025, the Switch had sold over 155 million units, making it one of the best-selling consoles in history. And that's the pattern. Nintendo fails, absorbs the hit, and adapts. Sega failed, panicked, and fragmented. Nintendo had the cash reserves to survive a bad generation because they never went on spending sprees during good ones. Sega spent like every boom was permanent and had nothing left when the bust came. Sega and Nintendo both stumbled. The difference is what happened after. Sega chased trends, split its own audience, let internal warfare between Tokyo and San Francisco dictate product strategy, and shipped hardware before the software existed to justify it. They confused speed with strategy. Every time they built momentum, they tripped over their own feet trying to sprint faster. And when the falls started compounding, they had no reserves, financial or reputational, to absorb the damage. Nintendo played the long game. They protected their franchises, maintained financial discipline, and understood something most companies never accept: that surviving a bad generation matters more than winning every single one. They never let the market tell them what they were. When the industry said graphics were everything, Nintendo handed people a motion controller. When the industry said dedicated handhelds were dead, Nintendo merged home and portable into a single device that sold 155 million units. Sega is still around today, a software company, an arcade operator. Sonic is still running, but they'll never make another console. Meanwhile, Nintendo, the company that was supposed to be too slow, too kiddie, too out of touch, just keeps going. Not because they were smarter than everyone else, because they were more patient than everyone else. The company that tried to win the war disappeared. The company that focused on surviving it is still here. If you made it this far, you probably like stories where the obvious winner loses and the obvious loser doesn't. I make these regularly. Business collapses, strategy failures, the decisions that looked smart until they didn't. Subscribe if you want to see more.